Welcome to the Positioning Show, where we discuss topics related to the practical application of positioning for marketing, sales, and product teams. I'm April Dunford, a consultant, author, and the world's leading expert on positioning for B2B technology companies. Hey, everybody. Welcome. This is a chunky episode this time around. I want to talk about the difference between positioning a single product company versus a multi-product company and how you handle that, which kind of leads us into what happens when you do positioning when you have multiple target segments, which then leads us into how do we handle multiple personas that we're trying to sell to within the target in an account. So this is a lot of stuff. So, pay attention. Here we go. So let's start with single product companies versus multi-product companies. So if we have a company that has multiple products, typically the company positioning is kind of an umbrella positioning that sits above all of the capabilities of all of the products underneath it. If I have a single product company, then there really isn't any difference between the positioning of the product and the positioning of the company. Now, I've worked with a lot of companies, like particularly startups, and they'll say, look, you don't understand. We're going to be the Dyson of whatever their industry is. And yes, we only have one product now, but the plan is to have hundreds of products. So we really need to keep those things separate. And yes, in the future, maybe you will. But a lot of companies that have a plan to have multiple products never actually get there. So I think the most practical thing to do is I have the product, I have the company, there's only one thing. Let's just keep it all together. This is actually why I recommend that you don't even have different names for these things. Like, I think you can just have one name. And if and when at some point in the future, you're branching it into all the other things and you actually do become like Dyson Labs of whatever, then you can add a company name to that, or maybe start talking about a company name that you always had. But I don't see the value in trying to position those two things as different when essentially the capabilities of the company and the product are exactly the same. Now, when we have a multi-product company, that's actually really different. So I have this umbrella positioning over top, generally, and we'll talk about exceptions to this, an umbrella positioning over top, and then each individual product gets positioned underneath that. So let me give you an example. So I think the examples are important on this because there's a lot of caveats. So when I was at, for example, IBM, here's how we handled this. So at IBM, our go-to-market strategy was really all about share of wallet in a named account. So typically, a big enterprise software company doesn't actually have that many named accounts. We're trying to sell to maybe a couple hundred accounts, and that's it. And so our goal was we want to sell everything we have into those accounts. So when we were marketing to those accounts and selling to those accounts, it was very, very important that the account understood the full breadth of everything we could do. So our marketing and our sales actually positioned everything as a starting point. And then we would click down into the individual things. Now you can imagine a company the size of IBM, that's a lot of stuff. Like, that's not just one or two little things. It's like a humongous amount of stuff. So here's how this worked in practicality. So I was in charge of a thing called IBM Information Integrator, which you probably never heard of, but in its day was doing a lot of money. But anyway, so I was in charge of that thing. That thing sat inside the database group inside IBM, which was a multi-billion-dollar product line. And that sat inside software group. Inside software group, there were 5 brands. We were one of 5 brands at that time. And so software group was, 30, 40 billion revenue. And software group sat inside IBM, which was hardware, software, and services. And that was, over 100 billion or whatever it was. IBM's smaller now. They sold off a bunch of things, but stick with me. This is back in the olden days when I worked there. So the way that would work, if I went into an account and was pitching my IBM Information Integrator thing, the story would always start with, hey, we're IBM. Why do you want to do business with IBM? And we would have this value proposition that was around, look, we're one of the few companies, or in fact, at the time, the only company that could give you a combination of hardware, software, and services. And so we talked about the magic that could happen when you had really tightly integrated hardware, software, and services all coming from one vendor. And then we would say, but you know what? Today we're here to talk about software. And so why would you buy software from IBM? And again, at the time, we had this neat story about, there's 5 brands inside software group, which would include WebSphere and Rational and Tivoli and DB2. And so we would talk about how our focus was on middleware. And here's the magic that would happen when all your middleware actually plays nicely together. And then we would say, oh, but we're here to talk to you about this thing that happens to sit in a database group. And so why would you buy database technology from IBM? Which, let's face it, that's a legitimate question. but, and then we had an answer for that too. And we talked a lot about the patent portfolio and the fact that we actually invented the relational database, and we had a bunch of cool stuff going on in research. And so we talked about innovation in databases. And then we would get down to my thing, which was this information integration thing. And so we'd say, hey, but today we're going to talk about IBM Information Integrator. Now, when I tell that story, people come up to me often, they go, man, April, like that's a lot. Like you actually did that every single time. You went from the top all the way down to the bottom. I said, yeah, every single time. And in fact, not just in the first sales meeting, because we never closed anything in a first sales meeting. Our typical deals were multi-million-dollar deals. So we had multiple sales meetings. And in every sales meeting, we told that story. The goal was everybody had to understand everything that we were doing because we were selling into an IBM account. And the idea was you weren't just buying that one thing, you were buying the whole IBM stack. Now, here's another important point. So sometimes inside IBM, like my own team would come to me and say, oh man, this would be so much easier if all I had to do was sell my little IBM piece part and not have to sell the grand vision of everything we had inside IBM. And the response to that, and this was very consistent across IBM, our thinking was, if this product was easier to sell outside of the IBM portfolio, meaning it was actually more valuable to customers without the baggage of all the other stuff, then our thinking was, well, why do we want that as part of the portfolio? Why wouldn't we just spin it out and make it its own company or sell it to somebody else? And so I think that's a legitimate question and a good way to think about that. So that's the way it worked for us. We'd start all the way at the top and then go all the way to the bottom. Now, like everything in life and marketing and sales, there are exceptions. And so sometimes that's not the way you want to do it because that is not your go-to-market motion. So at IBM, again, everything was considered equal. We were going to sell you everything upstairs, downstairs, sideways, all the way around. In some companies, that's not the way the go-to-market motion works. So a good example is Salesforce. And let's take Salesforce, not today's Salesforce. So let's run it back, Salesforce of like 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Their go-to-market motion is very different. So the go-to-market motion at that point was, we have an anchor product. And that anchor product is killer. And in the case of Salesforce, what it is the CRM, so Sales Cloud. So the idea of their go-to-market motion was then, if you didn't have any other Salesforce products, we're going to sell you the CRM first. And then we're going to worry about selling you everything else after. And that's a smart go-to-market strategy for a bunch of reasons. One, you've got this wedge into an account that is very, very strong. You've got a market-leading product that has practically no serious competition. You are double the size market share of your closest competitor. So why wouldn't you lead with that? That's your point of strength. And so they would put all their energy into selling that first. So if you look at the ads they were running at the time, even their homepage, everything just talked, we're the world's number one CRM. Because we wanted to sell you that first. And then if the customer buys the CRM, then we come in and sell the other things. So Salesforce has had Service Cloud and Marketing Cloud for a long, long time, but they never sold that first. The idea, they literally looked at those two business lines as upsell or cross-sell. And that's pretty smart. Because if I looked at it, like, let's take, for example, Marketing Cloud, that's a very competitive market. There are other competitors there that actually have more market share than Salesforce does. It would be hard for Salesforce to go in and say, we have the greatest marketing automation platform. But it is very, very easy for Salesforce to go in and say, well, we have the greatest marketing automation platform if you already have our CRM. And so sometimes I think it's much better for a company to decide what is our wedge into the account. Do we have a very easy wedge into the account? And then we put all our positioning focus on that. We position that as a thing on its own. And then we position everything else as cross-sell or upsell or essentially an add-on, even if it isn't an add-on and it's actually its own separate product. So I think the thing to take away from this is that there are big decisions that need to be made around this. Like you need to think about what is the portfolio of products that we have? Is there like a wedge product that we actually want to start with? And then we will worry about selling the other things once the company has bought that lead thing. Or are we truly treating all the different products as equal and we don't actually care which one the company adopts first? And then we're going to worry about cross-selling and upselling afterwards, or selling everything in a great big bundle, or putting it all together into something we call a platform. So I think the positioning and the go-to-market strategy is very tightly tied in that way. And you got to make some big decisions before you run off and start positioning the little piece parts of it. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is what do we do about segments? So let's say I have a product, but that product I sell to different market segments. So, I've got the bankers are over here using it for one thing, and the insurance companies are over here using it for something else. And I've got, maybe I've got retail segment and they're doing it for something else. And so people come to me and say, well, what do we do then? So we got all these different segments and they look pretty different. So should I have positioning for the bankers and then positioning for the insurance company and then positioning for the retail company? Here's a few things that I think you need to think about when you're in that situation. So first of all, often it looks like on the surface of it that the positioning for those different segments should be wildly different, but it isn't. And so let me tell you what I mean by that. So let's say, well, wait, I'll give you an example. So I worked at a company called Data Mirror here in Toronto, based in Toronto. I'm the vice president of marketing. I'm the brand new VP marketing. I show up and I do a big trawl through the data to see what do we got here? What do the customers look like? And I'm working through a segmentation here. And what I see is we have an interesting segmentation, and there's a pocket of folks using us in retail. And there's another big pocket of folks using us in utilities. Very, very different segments here. So I'm looking at that thinking, ooh, I wonder if those use cases are different. I wonder if we're really going to need to position differently in these two segments. So I'm out doing customer visits and stuff because I'm brand new. And I visit a bunch of customers in retail, and it's very consistent what the retail customers are using us for. So we were this kind of backup and recovery data synchronization thing. But the main use case that folks used us for in retail was to make sure that we had zero downtime. And so in a situation where you got a lot of data in a lot of different data sources and a lot of different types of data sources, our product could go in and make sure that if anything went down, it would instantly fail over to something else. And therefore, the cash register would always be up and you could always make a sale. That was the thing in retail. Now, if you went to utilities, it was, on the surface of it, seemed like a really different thing. They weren't worried about cash registers. They were worried about keeping the lights on. But when you really scratch down on the use case, it was kind of the same. Like lots of heterogeneity in the data sources, lots of different types of data across lots of different databases and different types of databases. And what they were really all about was if one of these things goes down, it just nicely, easily, efficiently fails over to the other thing and the lights stay on. On the surface, it seemed like those were two really different segments, but the use cases were kind of the same. Now, the sales reps would say, well, look, we can't position them the same because the competitors are really different. Like the folks we're up against in utilities are actually quite different than the companies that end up on a short list if we're in a deal for retail. But what was really interesting about it is if we went through the positioning process and said, who do we compete against? What have we got that the competitors don't have? How does that translate to value? was the exact same value propositions, exactly the same. The starting point was different competitors, but our differentiated capabilities were the same, translated into the same value propositions. So, do I have the same positioning for these two segments? At its core, yes, I do. I do. Now, in practicality, if I'm in a sales meeting and I'm sitting across from the CIO at Tiffany's, I am not going to pull up a case study that talks about what we did with some utility in Texas. I'm just not going to do that. So my case study is going to talk about that. But when I'm talking about at a million-foot level, the value we deliver is the same, whether it's utilities or retail. The homepage was the same. But when we got down into specific examples, we would always use a customer example that would map to the industry and the use case and the terminology of the customer we were sitting across from. Now, what happens if it actually is different? And sometimes you will get this, that, the competitors are different, the differentiated capabilities are different, therefore the value is different. Well, my friend, now we have a problem that goes way beyond positioning. This is the hard reality of this. Now what I've got is I got one product and it's doing two very different things for two very different segments. Do you know what's going to happen at that point? What these two segments want out of that product in the future for features, they're going to be different, man. And the things we're going to have to build to stay ahead of these very different types of competitors, that's going to be different too. So it looks like I got a positioning problem. Oh, I'll just position for here, position for there. But let me tell you, if you ever find yourself in this situation, what you actually have is a product strategy problem. Because now you got to decide, like, are we just going to kind of half-ass this thing? And, sometimes we'll build the things for the people on one side. Sometimes we'll build the things for the people on the other side. Like, you're going to end up in a situation where you're not making anybody happy. So generally, with companies I've worked inside where we've had that situation, we've had to make a choice about which segment we're ultimately going to serve. And sometimes what we ended up doing is we actually split the product and said, well, this is actually now two products and they're on different trajectories and we're going to name them something different. And one's for this part, one's for this segment, one's for the other segment. I've also worked in companies where the way we handled it was we had a base product or a platform, and then we had add-on modules that made up the extra functionality that each segment wanted. So we still had a base product that had common positioning across the segments, but then we would say, hey, but you're in retail, so you want these three things, and those are extra. We're going to price those extra, but they're add-ons. And over in utilities, we have these other three things, and we're going to price those extra, and that'll be extra over in utilities. But again, most of the time, on the surface, if you've got one product that's successfully serving multiple different segments, 90% of the time, the positioning does not have to be different. It'll feel like it at the beginning, and teams will come to me and say, I swear, April, is really different, really different. But then we go through the exercise and it just isn't. So I would challenge your assumptions on that and actually go do the work and see, do you actually end up with positioning that's different? This is good news, because if it's all the same, then I don't have to worry about having different positioning for different segments and whatever. It's also good news because if they're not the same, now I got to figure out, do I split this product apart or what is this actually in the end? The last thing I want to talk about is personas. This is the last sort of multi thing that gets people really hung up. In B2B, we're never just selling to an individual. We're selling to a team of people. And the research shows that a typical B2B purchase involves between 5 and 7 stakeholders. So when I started out in marketing, what I was taught was we needed to do personas for all of those stakeholders. And we needed to understand what was valuable and not valuable for each of those stakeholders so that we could essentially pitch them differently, because what they cared about was different. So let's say, for example, I'm selling some kind of a sales tech thing to the vice president of sales. The vice president of sales might have to get buy-in from the actual salespeople who are the end users. So they would be a constituent, but they may also have to get buy-in from IT, which is going to make sure that it meets the security requirements and they can look after it and a bunch of other things. So they've got completely different things they're worried about. You might have legal and purchasing that are going to get involved in the deal and make sure that we get the right terms and we've done this properly and it meets all the requirements. You might have a chief security officer that's involved to make sure it meets our security requirements and all the rest of this stuff. And then, of course, you've got the economic buyer. If the economic buyer isn't the same as the lead person on the deal, that means, it's usually that person's boss who actually writes the check. So that person's making a recommendation up to the boss. And they sometimes care about different things because they're worried about more than just that department. They're worried about lots of departments and how does this affect the company overall. So the way I was taught this is, you're supposed to do personas for each of those. And, so we had these persona things. And so I would have Eric, IT guy, and then I would have all this persona stuff that says, Eric hates talking on the phone and he really likes video games. And it was like a stereotype. And then we would have the salesperson, there would be like Sally salesperson, and she loves talking on the phone and she doesn't know what a video game is, and then we would have these. And so we would do all this work. And so we often had this like file, with all these personas in it. And we would spend sometimes like weeks and weeks on these personas. And then here's what would happen every time. We never use any of them. Well, that's not true. We would use one. After a while, I changed my thinking on this. And that's not just me, like experienced salespeople and experienced marketing people will tell you that, if we think about that deal team of 5 to 7 people, it's not actually a team generally. Generally, what it is there is a champion. The champion is either the person that has taken it upon themselves to enter a purchase process to try to figure out what to buy because they're trying to solve a problem for their department or themselves or something, or that person has been tasked with being the person that's going to make the purchase decision. So that is the champion. And this person's job is to run around and get consensus with the other 6 or 7 people that care about this thing. So again, if I come back to my example, I'm trying to sell a piece of sales tech. Let's say I've got the director of sales enablement is the champion. So VP sales looks at the director of sales enablement and says, hey, figure this out. We need some sales enablement stuff. Director of sales enablement says, okay, they're the one that's doing the search and Googling around. They're the one that's doing the research. They're looking at G2 Crowd. They're pulling the Gartner reports. They're reading all the research. They're talking to their buddies, like who does what in this space. And they're the one that's going to do generally the initial sales call with your salesperson. If you have a sales team, they're the one that's going to be the first person that goes in and signs up for a trial and pokes around. So the champion actually really matters. And for positioning work, the champion matters like literally times 1,000 versus everybody else that's involved in that deal. And here's why. If our positioning does not resonate for the champion, we don't make it on the short list. If we don't make it on the short list, who cares about the other 7 people? We don't get to go anywhere near them. So first of all, our positioning needs to resonate with the champion so that we get on the deal. Second thing, the champion has a very different role in the deal than everyone else. And you can kind of think about it this way. The champion is the person that can make this deal happen. Nobody else on that team can. IT's not going to make the deal happen. End user, in a lot of these cases, in this particular example, end user can't make the deal happen. Even the economic buyer can't make the deal happen because they don't have time to figure out what to buy. They need someone to make the recommendation. So the champion is the only one who can make the deal happen. Everybody else has the ability to kill the deal. So we got to treat them like that. So when I was doing all that persona work for all the different personas and everybody else, like it actually didn't matter what was valuable to them. What really matters in all these other stakeholders is what are their potential objections? How are they going to kill this deal? What is the thing that you don't do that they can potentially put their hand up and say, nope, can't pick that one, kick that one out. Nope, doesn't meet the ISO, whatever requirements. Oh, sorry, legal terms, can't deal with that. End users are like, I hate this. It's just stupid. I'm not going to use it. You can buy it, but I'm not going to use it. That's the way we need to think about all those other people. So from a positioning perspective, our positioning should be laser focused on the champion. And then our job, after we get on the short list and we got a deal cooking, our job is to arm the champion to manage the potential objections of everybody else on the deal team. If we keep that straight, then we're going to save ourselves a lot of work. We're not going to have a great big binder about, what IT likes and doesn't like and whether or not they like being on the phone. Like, we don't have to worry about that. What we really need to do, focus in on the champion and then arm the champion and say, look, champion, you're going to go into IT and we know what happens in IT because we've done lots of these deals. And here's the answer to all those questions. Or you're going to go talk to IT and they're going to have a bunch of questions and you may not want to deal with them. So bring us with you. Same thing when you go to the economic buyer. Same thing when you go to end users. Same thing when you go to purchasing and legal. The more you can arm the champion, the better chance you have of actually making this deal happen. That's all I got for you guys today. Hey, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. This podcast is new, so I would love it if you gave me a little review or some comments or some feedbacks and, subscribe and all that stuff wherever you listen to podcasts. And the website for this is positioning.show. I'll see you next week.